Great. Welcome all to the event today on evolution of clinical trials. We've got an amazing panel for you here today, providing lots of examples and case studies in terms of using remote clinical trials. Oops. Sorry, I think my video was off. Remote clinical trials, use of AI, and focus on regulation as well. Very practical event using lots of case studies and examples. So hopefully you will get a lot out of this session here. I should say we're running this event. So Aurora Digital, which is myself, is running this event in coordination with Tech UK and Midas. So thank you very much for their support. And in fact, Tom Russell will actually be moderating the session. Tom Russell is lead healthcare over at Tech UK. Just a short background on Aurora Digital you may not have heard of before. We focus with supporting and showcasing great tech from around the world. And what we try to do as part of that is run some thought leadership events, which have a tech angle as well, not exclusively a tech angle, but have a tech angle as well. And this is certainly one of those that we're running here today. So I hope you get a lot out of it. We've got an amazing panel for you. If you have any questions, we would love to hear them as the event runs forward. Otherwise, please share with us afterwards. We will send a poll out after the event. And with that done, I will hand over to Tom, who's going to be your moderator for the event.
Thank you very much, Sandeep, and welcome everyone to this great session that we have planned today. First up, we have Jonathan Wogel, who's the COO, and John McRae, who is the CTO for Northwest eHealth, and they're going to be talking to us a little bit about how clinical trials have evolved and look at organisations, as well as how sort of new technologies have the promise for helping to advance remote clinical trials. So with that, I'm going to hand over to John and Jonathan, who are going to be talking for about 15 minutes and share a couple of slides. And then crack on with the rest of this opening discussion.
Brilliant, thank you. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks, Tom, for the introduction. Yeah, so we're going to do a bit of a double act, I think, in our session. We're going to talk about a few things, a case study called the Salford Lung Study, which was a clinical trial which finished a few years ago now, but is very much apt for the conversation today. We're going to talk about improvements to trial feasibility and recruitment. That'll be mainly Jonathan talking about that, and some current projects, as well as some technologies to enable virtual trials and reduce trial costs. So I'm going to start. So hopefully you can see the first slide there, which is obviously about the Salford Lung Study and its design. So the Salford Lung Study, I suppose we're most famous for that, and we follow the model of that study even today. It was the world's first real-world, pragmatic, randomized safety and effectiveness trial on a pre-licensed drug. Now that's quite a long-winded way of describing a trial, but basically it means that it allowed patients in the study to be closely monitored in real time with minimal intrusion into their everyday lives. And I suppose, why is that different than a traditional clinical trial? Well, a traditional RCT can be a bit artificial. The Salford Lung Study was really asking, does this drug work in the real world? So it used a broad patient population and their interactions with medications for other conditions, which is quite unique. The Salford Lung Study, the name of it is not quite correct. There are actually two studies, one in asthma and one in COPD. And it wasn't just in Salford, it was in Salford and areas of Manchester. Apart from that, I think the name is correct. So this is a slide showing some of the numbers for the COPD study. 2,800 patients recruited. As I've discussed, it's quite a broad inclusion criteria. Patients in primary care over the age of 40, diagnosed with COPD, taking an ICS, a corticosteroid, or LABA and LAMA, beta bronchial agonists, that kind of medication, exacerbation in the last 3 years, and of course consented onto the study. And the reason we could recruit a broad population onto that study and can do that even today is because we monitor safety remotely in almost real time. It meant, as an example, we could recruit, there were a couple of people on the studies who were HIV positive and some other unusual, not unusual, but other rarer diagnoses that would normally stop somebody from being recruited onto this kind of study. What that also does is it cuts down the number of visits during a study. So it helps to make a study more virtual. So typically in the Salford Lung study and studies we do now, there are just 2 visits, one which is the randomization visit and one is the end of study visit, whether that's visit 6 as traditionally called, or just early withdrawal from the study. To enable this kind of study, there has to be a community of care involved. And what I've got is, I've got some numbers from near the end of the COPD study to show you who was involved in this kind of study. So obviously 2,800 patients, 80 GP practices were recruiting to the studies. We got data from 146 pharmacies. That included chains, but also corner shops. And again, quite famously, there was a computer system in a garden shed that we managed to get the data out of that pharmacy system. We had 3,000 people trained as part of the study. And we collected over 235 million rows of data from the electronic medical record. In fact, over 85% of the final 50 analysis data sets were used data that was collected directly from the electronic medical record. So just move on quickly to second slide. This shows really where not just the Salford Lung study, but real world studies sit within the clinical evaluation life cycle. As you can see there, because these studies can work on pre-licensed drugs, it does span the efficacy and effectiveness, the clinical development and pharmacovigilance stages of a clinical trial. As you can see there, 15 years is typically the length of time to get a drug to market from discovery. It's a very long time and it's very, very expensive. In fact, these figures were taken from a few years ago from work done by the FDA on clinical trials. So these are pivotal trial costs. So they're usually larger scale phase 2B, phase 3 clinical trials. As you can see, the cost of trials is, well, it's enormous. It's quite scary, really, that obviously the more patients you recruit to a trial, the more expensive these trials are. But as you can see there, $77 million for a trial with more than 1,000 recruits. So it's very important to reduce the amount of time to market in a clinical trial and to just reduce the cost in the trial altogether. So we've got a feasibility and recruitment tool, and that's called Farsight. And Jonathan, do you want to carry on for a bit and talk about Farsight?
Yeah, sure.
And how we use it?
Absolutely. So as John pointed out, the drivers here are cost and time. And also, I think the third driver is accuracy of cohort. When you go into, I spent 30 years on the device and drug side before I came to the trial side. So a lot of my career has been on the customer side of this, trying to get products to market and to approval. And the things that are important, obviously, other than just cost and time, are getting a cohort of patients that you can rely upon. So you've got legs of the trial that are well powered with good data coming out. And this is where Farsight really helps. So this flow chart here kind of shows you how Farsight works. It's an acronym: Feasibility Recruitment System for Improving Trial Efficiency. So first of all, we do a study to understand if the patients really exist. And right now, I'm working with a large multinational CRO, and John and I have developed a study, a feasibility study for them based upon using the Farsight technology to understand if hard to access patients with amyloidosis really do exist in the UK. So we've taken our database based in Salford and in London. We work with Imperial College as well, so Northwest London, and we've analysed the data and extrapolated out to understand exactly how many patients fit in the UK with inclusionary and exclusionary criteria for this potential study. Now, this has saved the sponsor company weeks and months of heartache and a lot of expense a lot of the time, because we can go in there and run in under a week a complete analysis and then do an instant prevalent rate extrapolation for the UK market. And this allows a CRO working with and their customer real confidence to power up the study and get going. And as John pointed out, these studies cost a lot of money. In a 400, 500, 600 patient study, that's tens of millions of pounds. So investing the time and effort to understand the market before you actually go live on the study, and involving us early days in the building of the protocol, using Farsight to understand what inclusionary and exclusionary criteria might be important to you in that study, I think it really helps pharmaceutical and medical device companies get a leg up on studies right now. There's also, I think, a real understanding of what's going on with the COVID marketplace. COVID-19 has impacted the entire world in ways that we're not going to discuss here, but obviously palpable in significant ways. One of those vectors we need to consider is, what does societal data do and drive in terms of healthcare delivery and healthcare access? We've seen different cohorts in the UK alone react differently to the vaccines, react differently to the news of a vaccine, and react differently to COVID-19 if indeed they are unfortunate enough to catch COVID-19. So layering in data, not just the health record data, clinical record data, but looking at socioeconomic data and looking at, if your societal data, and layering that on top, helps us better understand the impact of drugs and trials on different communities in the UK and indeed globally. And I think this will only become more important as time goes by, and as the lessons we've learned from the COVID pandemic become adopted into other clinical trials. I think also another key learning is that using AI and machine intelligence and really driving that drug discovery and development process means that time to market becomes compressed. And that puts more pressure on us to gather really good data and prove and demonstrate that these drugs are efficacious, that they're safe, that they can be used against certain indications. And that's where using a data set like Farsight, a system like this, where we work with trusts, we work with clinical event data, we understand the community practice down to the computer, the server in a shed, and up to working with a large university like Imperial. So we have that breadth and depth of understanding of the marketplace. And I think more companies will take that model on board and look at creating what we call nodes, where we have centres of excellence in a city like Salford, or indeed North London, an area like North London, where we can reach out to millions of patients and understand those data at the granular level, really prosecute those data and get down to an enriched and enhanced data set of possible candidates for inclusion into clinical studies. John, your thoughts and comments?
Yeah, good summary. I think, as you say, we've got the ability with Farsight to search the data, clinical record of millions of patients. As you said, we run trials in geographic centres of excellence that we call nodes, so you could call them other names. And you're right, machine learning then can supplement the search engine to try and find other variables of interest. It could be markers within the data that can help to recruit more patients to a study and find more patients for a study. Yeah. So I'll move on now to a couple of technologies we use to help to make trials more virtual, again to save costs, but also to generate more evidence, particularly safety evidence within the trial space. So here's a quick diagram of the usual data sources that get imported into data platforms for this purpose. As I've talked about before, we've got GP data, hospital data, either directly from a data warehouse or from the PASI EPR systems, pharmacy data out of hours, an ECRF to collect data that you can't readily capture still from within the electronic medical health record, national data sets. We're working on social care at the moment. And of course, everyone's talking about omics, wearables, AI. The model seems to be using AI and wearables to supplement the the medical record to try and predict indicators of things like exacerbations of asthma or COPD or other events of interest to try and preempt those kind of exacerbations and visits to hospital. So yeah, the two main areas I just want to finish on really is the remote safety alert system and study data management. If you think back to the slide I presented earlier, then the costs are quite extraordinary. $77 million sticks in the mind. Now, 15 to 25% of those costs can actually be site monitoring costs. So typically source data verification of data that's been keyed into an ECRF. So we want to try and reduce that wherever possible. So we've got the ability using source data to be able to use that to view the data remotely. So there are no site visits then by the CRA, or at least the CRA's visits are reduced. And a good reason for doing this, we saw in the pandemic, because during the pandemic, the sites themselves, the GP practices shut down. That paused clinical trials and actually risked some of the clinical trials from being shut down. So it's important to make these trials as virtual as possible. So we can view the electronic medical record remotely. We can restrict the access to that data to just consented patients as well, because the risk could be if somebody's at site and looks on the GP system, they can see data which is not consented. So I've just done some bullet points as well of why we use electronic healthcare records. We think it's more accurate. It creates double, in general, real world trials create double the amount of safety data from as opposed to a traditional clinical trial. Yeah, safety is processed in real time. And yeah, so some bullet points there. You can also then collect the long-term follow-up post-trial data of interest. Finally, I'm just going to quickly talk about the difference between safety monitoring and reporting in a standard RCT and that in a real-world trial. I think one of the main differences for me is that safety events and possible safety events, you no longer have to depend on patient recall. So typically in a clinical trial, on visit 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, the patient goes in to see the principal investigator who asks if there's been any issues. And the patient can say, well, no, I've been fine, but a month ago I did end up in A&E. So with this system, you can spot that event, that possible safety event, within minutes or hours. So famously, we had on one of our studies, we could see an adverse liver or kidney function test in the data. So our safety team phoned the hospital ward, and the hospital ward staff were unaware of that event. So the remote safety system saw that before the hospital staff were aware. It produces more evidence. It allows for less visits to the site by the patient on the trial, makes it more real world. So it's a great system that for generating evidence and reducing clinical trial costs. So I think to summarize, I think it's, if we use real world data, new technologies, AI, communities of care, then we can help to reduce trial costs and generate more evidence. That's my presentation done. I was done.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I think we're going to move on to the next session, and then there'll be time for sort of 5 minutes of questions at the end of this first section. So I'm going to hand over to Manoj now, who's the founder and CEO at Clinian, which is an integrated e-clinical platform for clinical trial setup. So I think he's got 15 minutes, and then we'll have 5 minutes of questions. So if any of the participants do have a question, then please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll come to you at the end of the session. Otherwise, I'm sure I'll have a few kind of things to get us started off with. So without further ado, over to you, Manoj. You are on mute.
Yes.
First one in the morning.
Thank you. Yeah. Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone. I'll be talking about largely about DCT, decentralized clinical trials, and I have a case study at the end, which I'd like to go through. So, without further ado, I'll jump into it. Yeah. Can everyone see my screen? Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, I can see it.
Oh, great. Thank you. Yeah, so we're looking at decentralized clinical trials. It's a simple agenda, right? Introduction to DCT. Most of us are aware of what decentralized clinical trials are. You would call them decentralized or remote clinical trials or virtual clinical trials, but they all mean the same thing in today's world. How do you do a clinical trial with the patient who's not coming to the site but at his home? We've talked about real world evidence, so that's all part of what DCT has to offer. What are decentralized clinical trials and what do they offer? One is home monitoring. So this part of the presentation is something which most people are aware of, at least from the clinical trial world. I look at a few advantages which decentralized clinical trials have to offer. Okay. One is home monitoring. So there's ample evidence that home monitoring of subjects is better than having them come to the site, because the sites is an artificial atmosphere and they would be most comfortable at home, and we would have better results or more accurate, more authentic results. So decentralized clinical trials allows you to do that. The traditional clinical trial system has discrete data points. So the patient comes to the site, we get some data from him, and then there's some silence apart from maybe some ePro activity or a patient diary activity, but there's silence till the next visit. Whereas if you're looking at decentralized clinical trials, there's a lot of, since the patient is being monitored at home, there's continuous data which is flowing, which allows us to understand how the study is going much better. We have data directly from the source, from the patient. So this data tends to be more accurate. As long as the devices, the technology is good, the data tends to be more accurate than the data which you get from traditional studies. The advantages we've seen during studies during COVID-19, which has given a large impetus to decentralized clinical trials, is that we are able to access more diverse and large population. One is that the costs of patients coming to the site and monitoring all of that is reduced. So we're able to actually recruit a larger set of patients. We're also able to reach patients who would otherwise not be able to come to the sites. Data is directly entered into the system, so it comes into the entire clinical trial platform directly. There's no transcription from paper to an electronic form. So data loss, time, effort, all of that is saved. Since data is continuous, more accurate, the data is available electronically at any point of time, greater clinical insights can be drawn from this data. And in clinical trials, the buzz is that everything should be centered around the patient. In traditional clinical trials, there's an effort underway to make it more patient-centric, but decentralized clinical trials really pushes that, so that since all your processes, technologies, everything has to be centered around how do you service the patient, how do you do the trial when the patient is at home. This actually pushes that a lot more than traditional clinical trials. Finally, of course, less site visits, patients coming to the site, recruitment, all of those costs come down. Systems which help in remote clinical trials may be expensive, but the costs of the other costs, operational costs, will definitely come down. do definitely come down, and they do result in a lot of time and cost savings. What are some of the challenges we see? Decentralized clinical trials have been there for some time now. They're not new, but the challenge has been that how reliable are there, and really, can we depend on them? Can we do a large study on them? How authentic is the data, and so on and so forth? Some of those questions are addressed here, and the big challenge, COVID has put rest to a lot of those doubts, but there's still a long way to go. One is, of course, patient monitoring, right? Most clinicians, investigators, CROs, sponsors they are like, we don't see the patient, we can't, talk to them. We don't see them in person, but just like every other industry has transitioned to an online mode. For example, like banking, it's time for the clinical research industry also to transition that, where in which you're looking at a patient remotely only through a monitor, or talking to them through a video call. There are plenty of tools which allow you to take care of patient monitoring. So the thing is to trust the technology, and go for good technology and trust the technology. IP delivery, another challenge, because medication sometimes need to be given in person. Not everything is a pill, and they may have to be returned. They could be lost. So again, the challenge here is to tie up with a trusted partner who can integrate his systems into your system, so that you have complete transparency into the supply chain. Data privacy. This is again, if you talk to proper opponents of remote clinical trials, or anybody who is skeptical about it, they would be like, what do we do about data privacy? Use the data. But then, if you look at the back industry, they've solved this problem a long time back, right? And it's no longer as much as a challenge as it used to be. There are occasional challenges, and that's expected of an industry. But this industry is going the same way as that. Safety and compliance. Now, this is more to do with the processes we have in place, the monitoring which we do. So there's constant monitoring, constant follow-up, constant checking, and also the trial should be set up in such a way that there's quick access to a patient. There should be systems, and there should be possibly sites or alternate sites available, so that some of these aspects can be addressed. Okay. Compliance actually goes up in remote clinical trials because of the number of patient engagement tools which are now in place. There are many ways in which you can engage a patient and make sure that he's more involved, and more involved with the study, and he continues to study. And dropout rates have reduced. If you look at remote clinical trials, there may not be enough studies to actually say for sure, but definitely remote clinical trials have shown lower dropout rates than traditional studies. Data analysis. Now, this is a critical component, and this needs to be planned ahead, because there's a lot of data which comes out of decentralized trials. So you have the traditional systems, your ePros, then you have wearables, then you have other electronic systems which are plugged in, and it could be the patient's phone, it could be some other device which is part of the study. It could be some data collection technique like a pacemaker possibly. So there's a lot of data which comes out of this, and this needs to be carefully monitored and analyzed. And this needs to be planned ahead of the study. Finally, the biggest challenge is regulatory acceptance. So if you look at the FDA has relaxed guidelines for during the COVID-19. The pandemic doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon, but if you're looking at what the regulatory stance would be subsequent to the pandemic, there would definitely be some changes from the traditional model. But however, what we need to keep in mind is that if the data which we gather from the remote clinical trial, is it of the same standard as a traditional trial? It has the same quality as a traditional trial. Then the FDA should not have a problem in accepting that data. Some of the trends in DCT. Okay, this is something which we've seen. So let's say if there's a patient, one is of course that there's a pure DCT is a long way off, or it may never happen because there are many trials which cannot work in a pure DCT mode. So the answer is definitely hybrid trials. Okay, so I will just run you through these. So a patient in a regular DCT or in a DCT, and this from our experience plus what we've seen is that, let's say he's interacting with a doctor online. He has a online appointment, online consultation. The doctor is talking to him. He's having various wearables, which gives a lot of data out. There's a support center which is talking to the patient on a regular basis, making sure that he's adhering, if he has any challenges, if he has any issues, addressing those concerns, right? Medication is being sent to him, being shipped to him direct to patient. And plus he has some, some software like an ePro or, any other software which he's entering forms, some forms which he's entering on a regular basis. Plus, whenever intervention is required, there's somebody who's reaching out to him or may go directly to the patient to take care of that. Now, this is what traditionally consists of DCT, but what we've seen is a mix and match of, traditional and, complete remote methods is what works and is what was working in most studies. So though the doctor may be talking to him online, there are times when the patient would need to visit the hospital, and that should be allowed. That it should be flexible enough. The trial design should be flexible enough to allow that. Wearables are good, but there are some patients who don't have the wearables. In that case, there must be an arrangement so that traditional methods of diagnosis, traditional method of investigation should be allowed. Because what happens is that you may depend on a patient to have some data. In terms of he would be more comfortable using his own phone or his own devices than some other device which you give to him. Similarly, in terms of medication, what we've seen is that we should give the flexibility to patients to collect the medicine. So either they can get it shipped, they have it shipped, or they should be able to visit a site and pick it up, or there should be a store nearby they can pick it up, right? So the comfort and of the patient is what is paramount. And if he is not comfortable using a tablet or a phone, smartphone, whatever, then they should be able to fill in forms which later get entered into an EDC. So the hybrid trials is what is very important. Next is BYOD versus provisioning. Traditionally, for the remote clinical trials, the sponsor used to provide devices for the patient to enter, but those weren't very successful because patients aren't very comfortable using multiple devices. They'd like to use their own phone. So it's more and more that patients just go to the app store, download an app, and start entering data, and that's into their own phone, which is available to them because that's closest to them, and they constantly look at it. So that's what it's moving to. It's no more provisioning anymore, right? Now, patient engagement. One is, how do you get patients more engaged? So there are more and more, the trend in patient engagement is that, of course, there's some reimbursement and some gift cards you provide. That's one. Plus, the patients are also asking for their data. So during the course of the trial or after the trial, we should be able to be in a position to give some data back to the patient so he can use that and improve his own lifestyle or understand how his own body is working. The next thing is that there's a lot of data which is being collected during the course of the study. Who does this data belong to? Of course, the patient, but right now that's a gray area. It's not being addressed, right? But that's definitely an area which needs to be looked into. Gamification. There are a few trials which, if you look at a lot of other apps, health fitness apps, for example, they give you digital rewards for reaching some milestones. The same gamification translated to clinical trials also would enhance patient engagement and keep him more focused, more compliant with the study. Finally, there are many patients who look at undergoing a clinical trial just so that they can help society, they can give back, right? So if involving them in such initiatives, letting them know that their contribution is very important. Data intelligence, I'll just jump this because I don't think I have much time. I'll try and wrap it up as soon as possible. Data intelligence, we collect a lot of data, so this needs to be carefully planned and managed because a lot of valuable data can come in. At the same time, we need to be careful that there's so much of data that it doesn't translate, become noise. A case study, we had a phase 3 trial recently during the COVID time. We did a phase 3 trial to evaluate efficacy for COVID-19 treatment. So there were 12,000 patients, 6 sites. It was remote. It was a remote area in India. The challenges were that there was a lockdown going on. People couldn't move out. They couldn't visit the sites, of course. The locations were remote, not easy to access them, large sample size. And the biggest challenge was we had a very short FPI, first patient in of 3 weeks. We had to get it up and running in 3 weeks' time. And of course, local language support was imperative. What we did, we integrated our ePro and our EDC solution, right? We built in an e-consent module so that patient e-consent can be taken remotely. He could sign in and give his consent. And so there was a support center which made sure that shipment and then there would patient recruitment, authentication, identification would take place. The ePro had multilingual support. Okay, we're able to put together all of this and deploy it in 3 weeks, so that in real time we could see that patient were entering data on a daily basis, and we could see the data as it was coming in, right? And the result. So we had 80% app usage. So it's about 10,000 subjects actually use the app, use the ePro patient diary to enter the data in multiple languages, right? The balance of them visited some sites, some filled physical forms. Okay, the dropout rate was only 5%, which was remarkable considering it was completely remote, right? We completed the study within stipulated 45 days, right? What worked was that basically that one was we had the multilingual support, the app which could be downloaded from the App Store. Okay, it was a short duration study, 45 days. So I think that worked for us, and there was flexibility in terms of how they could collect the medication. Okay, so multiple things worked, and the study was a success. Yeah, I'll stop now. Any questions? I guess we take them all at the end. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Manoj.